Hello, family. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also, share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The golden morning light slipped through the half-open curtains as Juliet moved quietly through the grand estate, her footsteps nearly silent against the polished marble floor. She had worked in Chris Adebayo's home for over 3 years, and while the house was vast and filled with fine art, imported furniture, and the soft hum of wealth, it was Juliet's steady hands and unseen labor that kept it warm. At just 30, she'd seen her share of pain, abandoned as a child, raised by her grandmother, and left to survive on her own. But in this house, though just a maid, she found a rhythm, a purpose. She prepared breakfast precisely how Mr. Chris liked it: omelet with diced peppers, lightly buttered toast, and green tea with a slice of lemon. She placed the cutlery just so, fluffed the napkin, and arranged the flower vase at the corner of the table. Everything had to be perfect. As she set the last item down, she heard his footsteps descending the staircase, firm, deliberate, always in control. Chris Adebayo, the 38-year-old CEO of Adebayo Holdings, was every bit the man newspapers painted him to be: intelligent, handsome, and fiercely private. "Morning, Juliet," he greeted, his voice as calm as ever. She nodded with a respectful smile. "Good morning, sir. Your tea is still hot." He gave a slight nod, but unlike other mornings where he'd make small talk about the news or his upcoming meetings, he sat down with a distracted air. He barely touched his toast. Juliet noticed his left hand tapping the edge of the table rhythmically, a subtle but unusual sign of unrest. Though she said nothing, her eyes lingered on him longer than usual. Something was off, but she remained invisible, as always, retreating to the kitchen with the growing weight of worry pressed against her chest. The sun had fully risen by the time Chris pushed back from the dining table and stood. Juliet, discreetly folding napkins nearby, caught the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his blazer. It was the phone call that changed everything. It had come moments earlier, private line, a voice Juliet didn't hear, but one that Chris clearly did not expect. His expression, usually unreadable, faltered for a second. His brows furrowed deeply, eyes narrowing in that peculiar way someone does when they're both confused and alarmed. He said only a few words: "I'll be there," but the flatness in his voice chilled the air more than any outburst could have. He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket, not meeting Juliet's gaze. "Something wrong, sir?" she asked carefully, her voice soft but steady. He hesitated before shaking his head with a forced smile. "Nothing that can't be handled," he replied, but even she could hear the lie. Juliet turned to return to the kitchen, but her heart had begun to race. She had been in that house long enough to notice small shifts in the atmosphere, when the air turned brittle with tension. This was one of those mornings. Chris was distracted, yes, but there was more. There was fear in the way he exhaled as he fixed his cufflinks, something urgent about how quickly he walked away from the table. He went into his study and didn't emerge for nearly 15 minutes. When he did, he wore sunglasses, odd for someone who preferred to move unnoticed, and walked with purpose, but without calm. Juliet followed at a distance as he made his way to the door. He stopped for a moment at the threshold and looked over his shoulder as if he had forgotten something, or someone. "Juliet," he said suddenly. She stepped forward. "Yes, sir." He opened his mouth, paused, and then shook his head. "Lock up after me," he said instead, and left without another word. Juliet remained by the door, her hand on the handle, staring after him with a heaviness she couldn't name. The air was unusually still, like the house was holding its breath. Juliet stood by the door long after Chris had disappeared into the corridor, a strange ache tightening in her chest. Her instinct, sharpened by years of moving silently and watching closely, screamed that something wasn't right. She reached for her scarf and, in a rare move, followed him out. The morning sun was blinding against the whitewashed driveway. Chris was already halfway to his car when she broke her own rule and called out, not as a maid, but as a woman desperate for a man not to walk into something irreversible. "Sir!" "Please wait," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to make him pause. He turned slowly, his hand still on the car door, and tilted his head in confusion. "Juliet?" he asked, eyebrows lifting. She walked closer, hands wringing in front of her, unsure what she was even asking him to stop for. I don't know why, but I feel you shouldn't go today," she said. "Call off the meeting, just for today. Please." He stared at her, a puzzled smile slowly forming. "Is that intuition talking or coffee grounds?" he teased lightly, clearly trying to dispel the tension. But Juliet didn't laugh. Her eyes were wide, sincere, and brimming with emotion. That unsettled him. He took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. "You've always been quiet, Juliet. You don't stop me unless it matters." "What do you know?" She shook her head. "I don't know anything. I feel it. I feel something's wrong." For a long moment, their eyes locked, hers begging, his searching. But Chris had spent his entire life not trusting fear. "I have to go," he said finally, almost apologetically. "It'll be fine, I promise." Juliet wanted to scream, to grab him, to block his path. But instead, she watched as he opened the car door and lowered himself inside. The sound of the door shutting felt final, like the end of a sentence she hadn't finished writing. She stepped back, trembling, her heart pounding as the engine revved. And yet, her legs remained rooted to the spot, as if her body knew something her voice couldn't say. The explosion shattered the silence with a force that tore through the walls of the estate like an earthquake. Juliet had barely returned to the living room when the blast echoed through the marble halls, an unnatural, violent roar that made the floor quake beneath her feet. She dropped the tea tray she had been holding. Porcelain shattered, glass scattered, but she didn't notice. Her ears rang, her vision blurred. Then the realization struck like lightning. "Chris." The word barely escaped her lips before she bolted barefoot out the door, her scarf flying off behind her. She ran toward the front gates, driven by panic, adrenaline, and the primal terror of loss. Flames raged where the car had been parked. Pieces of metal were strewn across the driveway like a war zone. Smoke curled into the sky in thick, dark plumes. And there, just beyond the twisted wreckage, lay a body, still, motionless. Juliet let out a strangled scream. A security guard rushed past her, shouting for an ambulance, but all Juliet could do was collapse beside the broken figure. Chris was barely conscious, his suit charred, his face cut and bloodied, but alive. His chest heaved with painful breaths. "He's alive!" she cried out hoarsely. "Call someone! He's alive!" Her trembling hands hovered over his body, afraid to touch, afraid to hurt him more. Chris's eyelids fluttered, and he winced. "Juliet," he whispered. "I didn't get in the car yet." Her tears streamed freely now, cutting through the soot on her face. "Don't talk. Just stay with me. Please stay." Paramedics arrived within minutes, forcing her aside as they loaded him onto a stretcher. Juliet stood there, frozen, her knees scraped and her palms bloodied, as the flashing red lights blurred her vision. The man who had just brushed off her warning, who had smiled and walked into fate, had barely escaped death by seconds. She didn't understand the how or the why. But in that moment, all she knew was this. Her world had changed forever, and the fire still burned behind her. The hospital waiting room was a blur of antiseptic smells, muffled footsteps, and murmured codes over the intercom. Juliet sat on the cold plastic bench, her hands clutched tightly in her lap, the edges of her dress stained with soot and dirt from the blast site. Her lips moved silently in prayer, her thoughts a storm of guilt, fear, and desperation. Every time the ER doors swung open, she jumped. "Juliet," a nurse finally called softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He's in surgery. Second-degree burns, broken ribs. Some internal bleeding, but he's stable." Juliet let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her knees buckled, and she fell into the nurse's arms, whispering, "Thank you. Thank you, God." But the calm was short-lived. Less than 10 minutes later, high heels echoed across the tiled floor, announcing Tracy's arrival. Tracy swept into the room like a hurricane dressed in grief, her makeup flawless, black gown hugging her curves, sunglasses hiding her eyes. She dropped her designer bag beside Juliet without even glancing at her. "Where is he?" she snapped. Juliet rose to her feet, her voice calm but firm. "He's in surgery. He survived." Tracy removed her sunglasses slowly, revealing eyes that glistened, not with sadness, but calculation. "Of course he survived," she said with an odd smile. "Chris always lands on his feet." The two women stood there, worlds apart, yet linked by the same man lying unconscious behind closed doors. "You were there when it happened?" Tracy asked, more like an accusation than concern. Juliet nodded. "I warned him not to go. I felt something was wrong." Tracy's lips curled into something that resembled amusement. "Feelings. That's sweet," she muttered, before sitting down and pulling out her phone. Juliet stared at her for a long moment. The woman who should have been falling apart seemed more annoyed than shaken. And in that cold hospital corridor, a seed of suspicion took root in Juliet's heart, quiet, sharp, and unshakable. By morning, the entire country knew what had happened. Billionaire CEO narrowly escapes car bombing was splashed across news tickers, trending hashtags, and tabloids. Reporters swarmed the hospital gates like bees to blood. Paparazzi camped outside, hungry for a quote or photograph. Juliet watched from a secluded window near the nurse's station, her apron still stained, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. The media frenzy made everything feel surreal. One article referred to her as an unidentified domestic staff member who may have witnessed the incident. She turned away. But the true circus began when Tracy stepped out for her first public statement. In a sleek black blazer and pearls, she stood before flashing cameras with the poise of a seasoned actress. "This has been the most traumatic experience of my life," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Chris is a fighter. We believe he will come back to us stronger." Juliet stood in the hallway watching her speak on a mounted TV, arms folded, heart tightening with every word. But Juliet noticed something others didn't. As Tracy wiped a rehearsed tear from the corner of her eye, she reached into her purse and subtly checked her phone, twice. Her thumb hovered, and she smiled slightly, as if confirming a message. Juliet leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. The world saw a grieving fiancé. Juliet saw a woman keeping score. Later that evening, when reporters tried to ask Tracy who might want Chris dead, she deflected with charm. "He's a powerful man," she said lightly. "Power always attracts enemies." Juliet felt sick. She knew Chris wasn't perfect, but he was deeply guarded. He trusted only a small circle. And now, he was too broken to speak, while the woman at his side controlled the story. Alone in the hospital chapel that night, Juliet knelt at the altar whispering, "God, if you're still with us, help me keep him safe. Don't let them take everything he built. Please, not him." Her words dissolved into the flickering candlelight as the shadows behind her deepened. The hospital room was quiet. The steady beeping of machines, the only sound beside the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes. Chris lay propped against the pillows, bandages covering his left arm and parts of his torso. His face was pale, the bruises vivid against his skin. Juliet stood at the doorway, unsure whether to enter. He looked different, wounded not just in body, but in soul. Ezekiel, his best friend and legal counsel, stood at his bedside, going over legal updates in a hushed tone. Chris motioned weakly for Juliet to come in. "Close the door," he said, his voice hoarse. She obeyed silently, her hands trembling slightly. "I shouldn't be alive," he murmured. "The bomb wasn't meant to scare. It was meant to finish me." Juliet stepped forward, her eyes welling up. "But you're here. You're still breathing. That has to mean something." Chris turned his head to Ezekiel. "That's exactly why I want to disappear." Juliet blinked. "What do you mean?" Ezekiel exhaled. "He wants to fake his death, make the world think the explosion succeeded." Chris looked up at her. "Whoever tried to kill me is close, too close. And if I stay alive publicly, they'll try again. But if I vanish, they'll feel safe enough to make their move." Juliet's breath caught. "Your company, your staff, your family. They'll mourn," Chris said grimly, "and I'll watch from the shadows. Only you two will know." Silence fell between them. Then Juliet spoke quietly. "You saved my job when others said I wasn't educated enough. If faking your death is how I protect you now, I'll do it." Chris's gaze locked with hers, something unspoken passing between them. "You've always been more than what the world sees," he whispered. Juliet smiled faintly. "So have you, sir." That night, Juliet walked out of the hospital with Ezekiel. As cameras flashed and reporters yelled questions, she wore black and kept her eyes on the ground. Inside, the man they mourned was already writing his second life, one breath at a time. The coffin lowered into the ground under gray skies and the weight of heavy silence. Juliet stood at the back of the gathering, her black scarf pulled tightly around her head, her eyes distant but dry. She had cried in private already. Now was the time to act. Every movement, every sigh had to be deliberate, mourning, but not breaking. Around her, guests sobbed, some genuinely devastated, others clearly there for status. Tracy, ever the grieving fiancée, stood front and center beside the casket, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, leaning into the moment as if it were her final performance. Juliet's gaze never left her. She didn't see a woman shattered by love. She saw a woman measuring the moment, calculating sympathy, sealing her place in public memory. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere had changed. Chris's absence was like a black hole in the center of every room. Staff moved about cautiously, unsure how to carry on. Juliet, now officially labeled house manager in Chris's instructions before his staged passing, kept a notebook in her apron and carried herself with quiet authority. She took over the garden schedules, the kitchen inventory, and kept the master bedroom locked under the guise of respect for the late Mr. Chris's memory. What the staff didn't know was that room contained a hidden drive, filled with Chris's confidential documents and voice notes only Juliet had been instructed to access. Each evening, she listened to his updates from a burner phone passed through Ezekiel. "Tracy's moving quickly," one note said. "She's already pushing the board for access to my shares. She's not even subtle about it." Juliet would reply each night with brief written updates. The secrecy was suffocating, but she endured it like armor. There were no more emotions, only purpose. She wore mourning like a cloak, but beneath it, Juliet had become something no one expected, a silent guardian. The estate no longer echoed with Chris's footsteps or familiar hums behind closed doors. Instead, it pulsed with Tracy's heels and perfume. Within a week of the funeral, Tracy began altering the house. Juliet watched, expressionless, as paintings were taken down, new furniture rolled in, and the color scheme shifted from cool neutrals to gold-accented dominance. "This place needs a woman's touch," Tracy declared one morning, tossing an emerald throw blanket across the couch with dramatic flair. Chris would have wanted this. Juliet remained quiet, nodding when spoken to, disappearing into tasks with the precision of a shadow. The other staff followed her cues, unsure where loyalties lay, but sensing Juliet knew more than she let on. One evening, as Tracy poured red wine into a crystal glass, she glanced at Juliet folding napkins at the sideboard. "You've been unusually silent," she said, voice casual but edged. "I would have thought this loss would break someone like you." Juliet looked up briefly, her face serene. "Grief shows differently in everyone, ma'am." Tracy smiled, but her eyes narrowed. "Still, you were his favorite, weren't you? The quiet little thing always lurking around." Juliet met her gaze for a beat too long. "I served Mr. Chris with respect," she replied, before bowing her head. That night, as the house slept, Juliet slipped into the study. The safe hadn't been touched yet, but she could feel Tracy inching closer. Juliet placed a discreet tracker under the study desk, connected to the burner phone. It would capture every future motion. Then she opened the drawer to retrieve the house logs, only to find the spare key was missing. Her stomach clenched. Tracy had already made her first move. The war had begun. Juliet worked swiftly under the dim light of the hallway lamp, knees pressed to the carpeted floor. She carefully installed a micro camera under the lip of Chris's study desk, its lens the size of a pin. Her fingers didn't shake. She'd done her research. She had no formal training, but survival had always been her greatest teacher. Just days earlier, she'd retrieved Chris's hidden ledger from behind the bookshelf. It outlined business deals, signed board agreements, and, most importantly, the location of a drawer he had never told Tracy about. That drawer, now suspiciously ajar, was supposed to be locked indefinitely. Juliet's breath caught. Someone had copied his key. Someone was already inside the nerve center of his empire. Later that night, when Tracy left for a spa appointment, Juliet entered her bedroom. It was bold, risky, but necessary. The room smelled of citrus and musk. Juliet moved quickly, opening the side drawer beside the bed. There, beneath a stack of fashion magazines, she found it, a silver duplicate of Chris's office key and a flash drive wrapped in tissue. She stared at it for a long second, then pocketed both and returned to the hallway, replacing every item she had touched. In the study, she opened the flash drive using the burner laptop Ezekiel had given her. Dozens of scanned documents loaded. Shares, board votes, contracts, papers Tracy had no legal right to hold. Juliet sat back, breath hitching. Chris had been right. Tracy was already consolidating power even before the ashes cooled. She clicked the camera app on the burner phone, now linked to the device in the study. "Let's see how far she'll go," she whispered. And for the first time, she allowed herself a flicker of emotion, rage dressed in silence. The following morning, Juliet locked herself in the storage room under the guise of inventory duties and opened the camera app again. The footage from last night loaded frame by frame. Her heart pounded as she watched Tracy enter the study at midnight, barefoot, wrapped in a silk robe. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show her walking directly to the drawer. The same drawer Chris had always kept locked, and pulling it open with ease. Her movements weren't hesitant. She had done this before. Tracy removed a folder, flipped through its contents, and placed a slim manila envelope into her purse. Then she smoothed her robe, glanced around casually, and exited. Juliet took a deep breath, paused the video, and saved the recording onto a second drive. It was the first real piece of evidence, and it wasn't just suspicious. It was calculated. Without delay, Juliet placed the flash drive into an envelope and handed it to Ezekiel when he came by later to check on the staff. In the privacy of his car, Ezekiel watched the footage and let out a sharp breath. "She's digging deep," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel. "We'll send this to Chris." That evening, Chris received the footage on a secure device. From his hidden location, he watched every frame silently. "She didn't even hesitate," he said coldly, rubbing his temple. "She's accelerating her plan." Juliet, in her next letter, wrote, "She doesn't even knock before walking into your space now. She acts like she was born for the role she's stolen." Chris's reply, delivered through Ezekiel the next morning, was brief. "Watch her. Don't interfere yet. When she believes she's won, that's when she'll slip." Juliet nodded to herself after reading the words. She could feel it too. Something darker was coming. But this time she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The days became a masterclass in duality. By sunlight, Juliet remained the modest house manager, soft-spoken, well-mannered, and invisible to most. She handled schedules, ensured the other staff didn't leave anything unchecked, and answered Tracy's whims with practiced grace. "Juliet, move my meeting with the florist. And please have my blue dress steamed. Not the royal blue, the sapphire one," Tracy barked one morning. "Yes, ma'am," Juliet replied, bowing slightly before turning to complete the task. But behind that quiet mask, Juliet was executing a second life. Each night, she wrote detailed letters to Chris, updates on who visited, what documents Tracy moved, and which accounts she appeared to be accessing. Juliet passed these notes discreetly to Ezekiel during his routine deliveries, tucked inside food baskets or placed beneath garden logs. It was a system only the three of them knew. But this double life took its toll. Juliet had no time for rest, no one to confide in. At night, when the rest of the mansion was asleep, she sat by the balcony with her knees to her chest, replaying the day's events in her mind, analyzing every detail for hidden meaning. Tracy, though clever, had grown increasingly arrogant. She strutted around the house like a queen uncrowned, often dismissing staff with a flick of her hand. "Honestly, Juliet, it's time we update the kitchen staff. Half of them can't even pronounce creme brulee," she said one afternoon. Juliet responded with a nod, hiding her disgust. But Tracy had begun to grow wary too. One night, Juliet found her standing outside the staff quarters, silently observing. "Just checking security," she said with a thin smile. Juliet bowed, masking her thundering heartbeat. "Let me know if you'd like me to call the guard." Tracy nodded, walking off without a word. That night, Juliet double-checked every corner of her room for bugs. She was being watched, and the line between hunter and hunted was becoming dangerously thin. It was a Thursday night when Juliet's suspicions reached a terrifying peak. She had just stepped out to collect the gate deliveries when she noticed headlights dimmed outside the estate. Not a delivery vehicle. A dark sedan idled near the bushes by the side gate. Curious, Juliet lingered behind the shrubs, her apron tucked into her waist, phone in hand. Minutes passed. Then Tracy emerged from the front door, her heels clicking rapidly on the concrete. She moved toward the sedan, her head covered with a scarf. The passenger window rolled down. A man in a fitted black suit leaned out. Juliet couldn't make out his face, but the familiarity between them was unmistakable. "You're late," he said, his voice sharp and low. "You told me the papers would be in my hand 2 nights ago." Tracy scoffed, pulling an envelope from her purse. "I had to delay. The maid's eyes are too sharp. She notices everything." Juliet's hands went cold. The conversation was brief, heated. The man pointed toward the estate once, clearly issuing a warning before speeding off. Tracy turned quickly, unaware Juliet had just recorded part of the exchange. Shaken but composed, Juliet returned inside through the kitchen entrance. That night she locked her door, played the recording twice, and wrote to Chris. "A man visited tonight. He mentioned documents, called me too sharp. You were right, she's not working alone." Chris's response came back in Ezekiel's handwriting the next morning. "Describe him. Don't approach them alone again. Stay safe. I need you alive more than ever." Juliet held the note against her chest, heart racing. She didn't know what kind of man Tracy was dealing with, but she knew one thing. This wasn't about love or power anymore. It was survival. The storm arrived in the early hours of the morning, wind, thunder, and a downpour that soaked the estate grounds before sunrise. Juliet used the chaos to slip into Tracy's room while she was still asleep upstairs in the spa lounge, where she had gone after her late-night rendezvous. Juliet moved fast, her bare feet silent against the tile. She went straight to the vanity drawer where she'd seen Tracy hide her phone the night before. It was still there. Quickly, she turned it on, took photos of the messages, and forwarded them to an encrypted number Ezekiel had provided. One thread stood out, Phase 2, comfort. Secure accounts. Final move within 10 days. Juliet's stomach twisted. Comfort wasn't just another executive. She was Chris's closest business partner, his longtime ally. Whatever final move meant, it wasn't good. She tucked the phone back just as thunder cracked through the window. Seconds later, footsteps echoed from the stairs. Juliet slipped behind the dressing screen and held her breath. Tracy entered the room, muttering into her earpiece, "No, you idiot. She doesn't suspect that much. I've handled her before. She's too afraid to confront me." A pause, then laughter. "Just make sure Comfort signs the documents tomorrow. Tell her Chris would have approved it." Juliet's heart pounded so hard it nearly gave her away. After several minutes, Tracy left the room again. Juliet waited until silence settled before crawling out and exiting through the servant passage. In the laundry room, she leaned against the door, her breaths shallow. She knew now this wasn't just about betrayal. Tracy was playing a long game. And Chris wasn't the only target. The list was growing, and Juliet had no doubt her name would eventually be added. Juliet wasted no time alerting Ezekiel. By noon, Comfort had been warned, discreetly and without full detail, just enough to delay signing anything. Juliet, meanwhile, returned to the estate pretending nothing had changed. But that afternoon, she noticed Tracy pacing the living room, her voice sharp as she spoke on the phone. "What do you mean she postponed? That woman always does what she's told." Tracy snapped, slamming her wine glass onto the glass table. Juliet passed by with a tray of tea and paused just long enough to be noticed. Tracy turned her gaze slowly. "Juliet," she called. "Yes, ma'am?" Juliet answered, feigning calm. "Why don't you take tomorrow off? You've been so attentive lately." Juliet smiled politely. "I'd prefer to stay, ma'am. The house feels empty without my routine." Tracy's lips curled. "How loyal," she murmured, her eyes scanning Juliet like a weapon. But loyalty was now a matter of life and death. That evening, Juliet returned to her quarters to find her drawers slightly ajar and a few letters displaced. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. She was being watched. She immediately texted Ezekiel. "They've started snooping. I think she suspects I'm more than staff." Later that night, Chris responded directly through a voice message for the first time since his staged death. "Juliet, if anything happens to you, I won't forgive myself. Stay low. You're not just my eyes now. You're all I've got." Hearing his voice broke something inside her, but she pushed the emotions down. Now wasn't the time for tears. She recorded a reply in a whisper. "I'm not backing down, sir, but if I disappear, you'll know who took me." When she ended the recording, her eyes lingered on her reflection in the window. The girl staring back wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a keeper of secrets, and the walls around her were closing fast. Chris stepped out of the rented SUV dressed in denim, a hoodie, and glasses. The stubble on his jaw and the subtle limp from his healing ribs helped sell the image of an ordinary man, far from the polished CEO who once graced magazine covers. With Ezekiel beside him posing as his cousin, he walked into the Adebayo Holdings headquarters under the identity of Mr. Uzo, a tech consultant. It had taken weeks of planning and fake credentials, but it worked. He now had access to the building under the radar, observing quietly. Inside the executive meeting room, he sat with the IT team, silently observing the charts on the wall and listening to the buzz in the corridors. What struck him most wasn't just how efficiently Tracy had stepped into his role, but how quickly people had accepted her version of the story. "She's grieving well," one HR director had commented with a sympathetic tone. "But she's sharp. She's already restructuring accounts." Chris clenched his fist under the table. It wasn't grief, it was conquest. In the hallway later that day, he passed Tracy without her noticing, her heels clicking, her voice commanding as she issued orders to a team of junior staff. "Tell legal we're freezing the Comfort Logan project until further notice," she barked. Chris ducked into an alcove, barely breathing. He pulled out his burner phone and texted Juliet. "She's repositioning herself. Freezing Comfort out." Minutes later, her reply buzzed in. "She's hiding something in your study. I've kept the drawer under surveillance." That night, from his small apartment on the outskirts of the city, Chris replayed every file Juliet had forwarded, the recordings, the photos, the logged visitor times. "She's not just after my name," he whispered to himself. "She's building a throne on my bones." He sent Juliet a final message before bed. "You've done more than I ever expected. You're not my maid anymore. You're my last ally." And somewhere in the house where Tracy slept soundly, Juliet sat in the dark, reading that message, her fingers pressed to her lips, not in fear, but in quiet purpose. The tension in the mansion had thickened like smoke. Juliet felt it in the way doors slammed just a little harder, in the way Tracy's glances lingered on her too long. The staff had begun whispering too, Tracy's late-night calls, her increasing paranoia, her tendency to cancel appointments without warning. That morning, as Juliet swept the grand staircase, Tracy appeared at the top step, arms folded, eyes sharp as broken glass. "Why are you still here?" she asked. Juliet straightened. "Ma'am, you heard me. Why haven't you asked to leave? Everyone else is moving on, even his own relatives." Juliet took a step down, broom still in hand. "Because I was hired to serve this house. And until that contract changes, I stay where I belong." Tracy gave a hollow laugh. "Loyalty, huh? Or is it guilt? Or are you just too nosy to walk away?" Juliet kept her posture firm. "I don't pretend to understand grief the way you do, ma'am. I just do my work." For a second, something flickered in Tracy's eyes, recognition, maybe even threat. "Well, consider this a formal warning," she said, descending a few steps. "If I catch you snooping in places you shouldn't be, you won't be dismissed. You'll be exposed. I'll make sure of it." Juliet met her gaze steadily. "Understood." That evening, Juliet made no report. She didn't need to. The confrontation spoke volumes. Tracy was unraveling. Her need to control was slipping into aggression, and aggression always led to mistakes. Juliet returned to her room, locked the door, and checked the study camera feed once again. The drawer was still untouched, but the scent of danger now lingered in every hallway. She sat at her desk, opened her notebook, and wrote, "She confronted me today. She's watching, but she's also cracking. Whatever you're planning, sir, make it soon." The house had fallen into a false silence by midnight. Juliet had just slipped off her shoes and laid down when she heard soft footsteps outside her room. Not the careful ones of a maid or the heavy steps of the guards, but lighter, deliberate, cautious. She sat up, heart thumping. A shadow blocked the slit of hallway light under her door. Then a soft knock. "Juliet." Tracy's voice low and firm. Juliet stood and opened the door halfway. "Yes, ma'am." Tracy didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. "I think you and I need to talk," she said, eyeing the small desk in the corner. "You've been spending a lot of time alone these days. Writing a diary. or something more? Dangerous. Juliet moved calmly in front of the desk. It's just thoughts, ma'am, nothing more. Tracy walked around the room like a hawk circling prey. I've been kind to you, Juliet. Kept you when Chris hired you out of pity. But I won't be made a fool of. Not by a maid who stares too long and listens too closely. Juliet's face remained calm, but her voice grew firmer. You think watching quietly is dangerous. Maybe it's what kept him alive. That struck a nerve. Tracy's eyes darkened. Without warning, she raised her hand and slapped Juliet hard across the cheek. The sound cracked the silence. Juliet didn't move. She stood, breath shallow, tears stinging, but not from pain. She looked Tracy dead in the eyes. Do it again, she whispered, and I swear the part of me you underestimate will wake up. Tracy's chest rose and fell rapidly. She stepped back, smoothing her blouse. Watch yourself, Juliet. She turned and stormed out. Juliet slowly closed the door and leaned against it, her cheek burning, her eyes wide with unshed emotion. But across the room, the small camera tucked beneath the lamp had caught everything. And Juliet? She now had proof that silence wasn't her weakness, it was her weapon. The night after the slap was colder than any Juliet could remember. She sat at her desk with trembling fingers, pen hovering above the paper. Her cheek was still tender, but that wasn't what hurt. It was the weight of everything she hadn't said. The exhaustion, the longing, the way Chris's voice echoed in her thoughts every time the silence grew too loud. Tonight's letter wasn't just an update. It was something else. She began slowly. Sir, I'm tired. Not from spying or planning, but from holding everything inside. I don't know what I am to you, just a maid or maybe a friend, but I miss you. More than I expected to. Her words flowed like a dam breaking. I miss how you used to greet me in the mornings. I miss your calm voice in the study. This house is a cage now. And the only reason I'm still breathing is because somewhere out there, you are too. She paused, then did something she'd never done. At the bottom of the page, she drew a small heart beside her name. Juliet. But after staring at it for minutes, she tore the letter in half. Then again, and again, she burned the scraps in the kitchen sink before dawn. When Ezekiel came later that morning, she simply handed him the usual neutral report. No emotions, no heart, just facts. Anything else you want to add? He asked, sensing the tension in her shoulders. She shook her head. Not today. That night, Chris sat in his small apartment, listening to the audio clip she'd recorded earlier, the faint footsteps, the confrontation, the slap. But he didn't hear the letter that had never made it to him. He didn't hear the part where she said she missed him. He just stared out the window, whispering, "You're doing too much for a man who gave you too little." And across the city, in her dark room, Juliet whispered something back to no one at all. I would do it all over again. The evening air shimmered with champagne bubbles and shallow laughter. Tracy had transformed the estate's garden into a grand event space. Fairy lights strung between hedges, white orchids spiraling up marble pillars, and an orchestra playing soft jazz near the fountain. She wore a scarlet form-fitting dress that clung to her like a second skin, the neckline daring, the smile on her face practiced. Juliet stood in the background near the drinks table, dressed in black, her presence unacknowledged, but her eyes alert. The party had a purpose, and everyone knew it. But the announcement came like a quiet bombshell. Tracy tapped her glass and raised her voice just enough. I'd like to thank you all for being here, and to let you know that Chris Adebayo and I were engaged before his tragic death. And though he's gone, he left everything in place for me to continue his legacy. The crowd gasped softly, some nodding sympathetically, others murmuring in confusion. Then she raised a slim folder. This, she declared, is the updated deed to the Adebayo Holdings shares. Transferred to me, as agreed, before his passing. Juliet's breath caught. No one had seen that document, certainly not Ezekiel, who had been handling the actual will. Juliet quietly slipped away from the crowd and texted him immediately. She's presenting forged papers. She just announced herself as Chris's legal heir. Within seconds, Ezekiel replied, she's bluffing. We still have the real draft. Watch who reacts. Juliet returned to her post, her mind racing. The cameras caught everything. Tracy's performance, the document, the looks exchanged. Juliet's fingers itched to confront her, but she knew better. There would be a time. And when it came, it wouldn't be in the form of a scandalous headline. It would be justice that walked in uninvited and quieted every lie. The very next morning, the air around the estate turned heavy. Word had spread about Tracy's declaration, and Juliet could see the shift in how staff whispered behind closed doors. At noon, Ezekiel arrived dressed in charcoal gray, briefcase in hand. "Tracy's lawyer has requested a meeting," he told Juliet as he entered the house. "It's time to shake the stage." In the grand hall, the sitting room had been transformed into an informal legal space. Tracy arrived late, dressed modestly now, projecting grace and mourning once more. "You're just here to validate what I already said," she quipped, tossing her hair. "Chris was mine, and his company is mine, too." Ezekiel didn't flinch. Instead, he placed a sealed envelope on the table. "Actually," he said, "this is the last draft of Chris's unsigned will. It was emailed to me just days before the incident." Tracy's smile wavered. "Unsigned. Then it means nothing." "Not quite," Ezekiel replied, sliding the paper out. "It has voice authentication. Chris had a habit of recording audio notes along with every legal update. We have a file logged, dated, and verified. Would you like to hear it?" He pressed play. Chris's voice filled the room, calm and clear. "Juliet Okafor is to retain full access to my private residence and be recognized as my most trusted witness. Ezekiel will hold all documents until further instructions are given." There was a hush. Tracy's face paled, her lips parted, but no words came out. Juliet, standing quietly by the side, lowered her eyes. She hadn't known she was mentioned. It felt like validation, pure, unexpected, and undeserved. I demand to see that file myself," Tracy stammered. "And you will," Ezekiel said smoothly, "in court." He stood. "For now, I'd advise you not to destroy or present any more documents until proper authentication is completed." Juliet followed him out, heart pounding. For the first time, the tide had turned, and Tracy knew it too. That night, Juliet found herself in the garden, away from lights and voices. The moon cast silver shadows across the lawn, and the wind rustled through the trees like whispers too old to translate. She had held her breath for so long, worn her silence like armor, kept her head bowed even when her heart screamed. But tonight, something inside her cracked. She knelt by the bench under the guava tree, the one Chris used to sit at while making calls, and finally allowed herself to weep. The sobs came in waves, deep and guttural, for the fear she had buried, for the pressure of carrying a secret too heavy for one heart, for missing a man who wasn't dead but still so far away. "I'm tired," she whispered into the wind. "I'm so tired." Her hands trembled as she clutched the scarf around her neck, her tears falling onto the hem of her blouse. She didn't hear footsteps approach until Ezekiel's voice broke through the quiet. "Juliet?" She turned, embarrassed, trying to wipe her face. "I didn't expect anyone." He stepped closer but didn't intrude. "You've held more than anyone should," he said gently. "But the end is near. You've bought him time, protected his name, and soon you'll witness the truth win." She nodded slowly, then looked up at the sky. "Do you think he'll forgive me for keeping everything inside?" Ezekiel paused. "Forgiveness isn't what he'll feel when he sees you. It'll be gratitude." Juliet smiled faintly through her tears. That night, she didn't return to her room. She stayed under the stars, whispering prayers and fragments of letters never sent. And the wind carried them, maybe to Chris, maybe to no one. But she needed the release, because even quiet warriors need a place to cry. The morning after Juliet's breakdown began with a knock on the estate's back entrance. It was early, too early for staff deliveries. She opened the door cautiously, heart thudding, and froze. Chris stood there, disguised in a hoodie and sunglasses, his posture slightly hunched from recovery, but very much alive. Her breath caught in her throat. "Sir," was all she could manage. He stepped inside without a word, removed the glasses, and stared at her, his eyes filled with unspeakable emotion. "I couldn't stay away anymore," he said quietly. "I had to see you. Not Ezekiel, not the cameras. You." Juliet stepped back, unsure if she was dreaming. "You shouldn't be here. Tracy, she's still in the house." "I know," he said, "but I needed to look you in the eyes and tell you what I never said. You saved my life. Every day since the explosion, it's been you holding everything together. Not the lawyers. Not the guards, you." Juliet swallowed hard, eyes stinging. I didn't do it for recognition, sir. I did it because you mattered to me more than I let on. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Chris stepped closer, gently brushing her cheek where Tracy had once struck her. I saw the footage, he murmured. She hurt you, and you still stayed. Juliet's tears spilled over. I didn't know how else to protect what was left of you. Then suddenly, his lips pressed softly to her forehead, a kiss that wasn't romantic, but reverent. A gesture of quiet thanks. Juliet closed her eyes, trembling. When he pulled back, his voice cracked. After all this is over, I don't know what comes next for us. But I promise you this. I'll never forget what you gave up for me. Juliet nodded, unable to speak. They didn't hug. They didn't confess anything further. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty. It was sacred. The boardroom of Adebayo Holdings buzzed with tension as top executives, investors, and Tracy herself filed in. She wore a fitted navy blue suit and an air of unshakable confidence, heels clicking with calculated power as she took her seat at the head of the table. Let's begin, she said coolly, adjusting her papers. Today we discuss finalizing the Comfort project. I've brought the necessary documents for your approval. Murmurs rippled through the room. But before anyone could respond, the double doors opened. Chris walked in. No disguise, no limp. Just presence, authority, living proof. The room fell into stunned silence. Several gasped audibly. One executive dropped his pen. Tracy's smile died on her lips, her body stiffening as if the ghost of her sins had materialized. Impossible, she whispered, rising slowly. You're dead. Chris moved to the front of the room, eyes never leaving hers. Sorry to disappoint you, Tracy. His voice was calm, but the storm beneath it rippled in every syllable. I died only in your plans. And this meeting, this company, it still belongs to me. Tracy's breath hitched. You faked it. All of it? No, someone tried to kill me. I just used their mistake to expose them. He turned to the others. I have evidence. Footage, signatures, witnesses. He pointed toward the door, where Juliet entered quietly, holding a tablet. Everything you need to know is right here. The board members watched in shock as Juliet connected the device and began playing clips, Tracy copying keys, meeting the mysterious man, discussing Phase 2. Tracy turned pale. You can't prove intent. You forged legal documents, Ezekiel interrupted from the side. That's a crime whether intent succeeds or not. Chris faced her one last time. You wore red to bury me. I'm wearing silence to bury your lies. And with that, the board turned on her, not with shouts, but with questions she couldn't answer. Her reign had ended, not in fire, but in truth. The moment Juliet handed over the last file, Tracy sprang from her seat, heels clacking frantically on the marble floor. You won't get away with this, she shouted, her voice rising above the murmurs. You planned this. You think I'm the only one who wanted him gone? Security stepped forward, but she darted toward the side door, knocking over a glass pitcher as she ran. Don't touch me. I'll expose all of you, she screamed. Outside, the building lobby was filled with journalists who had gotten wind of the shocking revelation. Flashbulbs exploded as Tracy burst through the revolving doors, hair disheveled, makeup running. The perfect mask of elegance shattered in seconds. No comment, she shrieked as they shouted her name. Just then, two plainclothes officers approached and blocked her path. Tracy Iodell, one of them said calmly. You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and attempted corporate theft. Juliet watched from a window on the second floor, chest rising with relief, hands still trembling. Chris stood beside her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. She didn't even hesitate, he murmured. She would have burned the world down if we let her. Juliet nodded, her voice soft. But she forgot, fire consumes everyone, even the one holding the match. Down below, Tracy was cuffed and read her rights, her final defiance cracking into sobs as the cameras rolled. The same woman who had walked through that company like she owned it, it was now being walked out of it like a lesson in arrogance. Chris turned to Juliet, finally letting his shoulders fall. It's over, he whispered. Juliet didn't respond. Instead, she gently placed her hand over his for the first time. Not yet, she said. It's only just beginning. And in that moment, with the truth laid bare and the storm passing, they both knew something deeper had survived with them, dignity, loyalty, and a quiet kind of love that didn't need to be spoken to be known. The halls of the estate felt strangely still in the aftermath. The noise of Tracy's reign had gone silent, leaving behind a quietness that wasn't empty. It was cleansing. Juliet moved through the house with grace, collecting the remnants of a war fought in silence. Boxes of Tracy's belongings packed, her framed photos removed, and the scent of her perfume finally fading. That evening, Chris called the staff into the living room. He stood beside Ezekiel, now without bandages, in a black button-up and quiet authority. "You've all served this house with dignity through a difficult time," he began. "But there's someone among you who didn't just serve. She protected, endured, and gave far more than her duty required." His eyes found Juliet in the back, her hands still folded humbly. "Juliet Okafor is no longer the maid of this house. As of today, she's my personal assistant and the new estate manager." The staff murmured in shock, but with admiration. Juliet stepped forward, her heart thudding, unsure how to carry such a title when she'd worn humility like skin for so long. "Sir, she began, but Chris raised a hand gently. "You don't have to thank me. I should be thanking you." There was a pause, then a small clap from one of the guards. Another followed. Soon the room echoed with applause, warm, honest, and earned. Ezekiel leaned toward her and whispered with a teasing grin, "Told you he sees you." She lowered her gaze, a small smile tugging at her lips. That night, in her new room just a floor below Chris's, Juliet unpacked not her things, but her silence, her journal, her observations, her fears, all of them tucked away like fading shadows. She stood by the window, looking out over the city. No longer a servant, not quite a lover, but something greater. A woman who had survived and changed everything without ever needing to raise her voice. A week after Tracy's arrest, Juliet's world changed again, this time behind the polished glass doors of Adebayo Holdings. She walked into the towering building in a tailored navy skirt and crisp white blouse, hair neatly braided into a crown. The receptionist glanced up, confused at first. "Miss, can I help you?" Juliet smiled softly. "I'm Juliet Okafor. I'll be working on the executive floor from today." A pause. Then recognition. Word had spread. She was no longer just the house staff. They now whispered her name like someone out of legend. Upstairs, Chris introduced her formally during a leadership meeting. "Juliet will be assuming the role of executive house manager and special assistant to the CEO," he announced. "Any communication to my desk now goes through her." There were shocked glances, but no objections. Juliet stood tall beside him, calm but alert. No notes, no stammering, just presence. Later that day, Juliet entered her new office, a modest but elegant space beside Chris's. There was a warm note on her desk from Ezekiel. "You earned this with silence louder than noise." She smiled and tucked it into her drawer. Just as she was organizing files, Chris walked in, tie loosened. "Settling in?" he asked. "Trying to," she replied. "The desk feels too clean. I'm used to wiping crumbs from the dining table, not reviewing policy memos." He laughed, a soft, genuine sound she hadn't heard in weeks. "You'll grow into it. Like you grew into everything else." She paused. "And what will we grow into?" The words slipped before she could catch them. Chris looked at her, eyes unreadable. "Let's figure that out one day at a time." With that, he turned to leave, but not before glancing over his shoulder. "Juliet? Yes, sir? You belong here. Don't ever doubt it again." The door clicked shut behind him, but her heart remained wide open. The rain tapped gently against the kitchen windows, a soft, rhythmic sound that filled the quiet air. It was late evening, and the mansion was mostly dark except for the golden glow of the kitchen lights. Juliet rolled up the sleeves of her Ankara blouse as she sliced ripe plantains. She moved gracefully, humming under her breath. Behind her, Chris entered quietly, barefoot, in a white t-shirt and gray slacks. "Smells like peace in here," he murmured. She turned, startled, but smiled. "Just dinner. I needed the warmth." He leaned against the counter. "Mind if I help?" Juliet chuckled. "You know how to cook?" "No," he said, picking up a tomato, "but I'm willing to learn." For the next hour, they moved like dancers, passing spices, tasting sauces, brushing fingers by accident, and pretending not to notice. As the food simmered, Chris leaned on the island, watching her. "I used to think survival meant walls and solitude," he said quietly. "But maybe it's found in simple things, like a kitchen the sound of laughter, and someone who listens. Juliet looked up, her expression softening. Listening is easier when you care. He nodded. I care more than you know. For a long moment, they didn't speak. Then he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Juliet, yes, sir. We're not in a boardroom now. You can call me Chris, she smiled. All right, Chris. They didn't kiss. They didn't confess. But as they plated their meal and sat across from each other at the wooden kitchen table, the tension melted into something deeper, quiet joy. There were no titles in that moment, no trauma, no past, just two souls who had walked through fire and ended up somehow side by side in the softest light. The mansion had grown quieter in recent weeks, not from absence, but from peace. With Tracy's chapter closed and stability returning to Adebayo Holdings, life fell into a gentle rhythm. Juliet rose early each morning, now reading business reports before breakfast instead of preparing it. She and Chris worked side by side in harmony, never crossing lines, yet never forgetting they had once almost died for one another. One quiet afternoon, Juliet sat in her office, staring at a blank piece of stationery. For weeks, she had written dozens of letters to him in her head, confessions she'd never said aloud. Today, she tried again. Her hand trembled slightly as she began. There are things I never said when I had the chance. Not because I was afraid of you, but because I was afraid of how deeply I felt seen. She paused, sighed, and continued. You were never just my employer. You were the storm that shook me awake. The reason I stood still when others ran. I could have loved you loudly, but instead I chose to stay quiet just to stay close. When she finished, she signed it without a name, sealed it, and slipped it into the drawer. She would never deliver it. That night, as Chris left his office, he paused at her door, lingered, then turned away. In his study, he stared at the old photo of Juliet watering the garden years ago. There was a softness in her eyes that hadn't changed. You never asked for anything, he whispered into the empty room. And that's why I could have given you everything. But no words were exchanged the next day. No confessions, no final declarations. They chose silence, not because love wasn't there, but because love, in its purest form, doesn't always need to be spoken to be understood. Years passed. Not many, but enough for time to leave its fingerprints in subtle ways. More laughter lines around Juliet's eyes, a steadier calm in Chris's voice. The mansion was now run like a quiet kingdom. Juliet's name was etched in the company's leadership records, not as a token of loyalty, but as a woman who earned her place through wisdom, not war. She often spent her mornings on the garden terrace with a tablet in hand and coffee beside her. Chris would join her sometimes, discussing contracts, reviewing reports, or sharing articles that made her smile. Still, they never spoke of the past, not the explosion, not Tracy, not the nights spent hiding their feelings beneath silence. Some stories, they both understood, were too sacred to be retold. On a golden Thursday morning, Juliet brought Chris his usual coffee, 2 sugars, no cream. He was in the study, reading a printed proposal, brows slightly furrowed. She placed the cup beside him gently. Your favorite, she said. He looked up, his eyes tired but grateful. Thank you, Juliet, she nodded, offering a small smile. Always, sir. Their eyes lingered, warm and familiar, carrying the weight of everything they never said. In another life, perhaps, they might have danced barefoot in the kitchen or carved their initials in a tree. But in this life, they had chosen something quieter, partnership without possession, love without labels. As Juliet stepped out into the morning sun, a gentle breeze lifted the hem of her skirt. She looked back once, then walked forward with quiet confidence. Chris sipped his coffee, eyes still on the door she had closed. And somewhere in the space between them, unspoken and eternal, love stayed. Here's the Bible verse, Proverbs 3 verses 3 and 4. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. Why this verse fits. Juliet's unwavering faithfulness and quiet love were never about recognition, yet in the end, her integrity and grace elevated her to honor. Her loyalty wasn't loud, but it was lasting. This verse reflects her journey perfectly. Moral of the story. True power is not always loud. It often wears the face of silence, sacrifice, and steady love. Juliet's story teaches that strength doesn't need applause, and love doesn't always need words. It's in the consistent acts of loyalty, the quiet protection of truth, and the refusal to seek revenge, even when wronged, that real dignity is revealed. Those who walk humbly and serve sincerely are often the ones God exalts when no one is watching. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.